Rumors of monks locked in meditation for years in pitch-black caves, corpses being cut up and fed to vultures, and levitating sorcerers all made Tibet a destination of extreme appeal for Europeans in the 1800s. The crown jewel of these mysteries was the mysterious city of Lhasa, which so enchanted several men and women that they threw away their fortunes, families, and their own lives to reach it. What was it that these explorers wanted to discover? The deepest depths of Tibetan temples were known to conceal great secrets, and the lands of this real-life Shangri-La were full of gold which was so abundant that it could be found lying on the surface. To those who trespassed into Tibet, it was worth every risk. Until then, no foreigner had seen the city of Lhasa, which was isolated on the remote plateau of Tibet and surrounded on all sides by the highest mountains on earth. Yet the time had come for several explorers from many Western nations to attempt to unravel Lhasa's mysteries. The first to make moves into Tibet were the English, who controlled India in the 1860s. Officers of the British government in India decided to disguise local Indians as traders on their way into Tibet. It was hoped that with special training, these men could fill in the maps of Central Asia, which until then had left Tibet blank except for the word unexplored. These men trekked far into Tibet and were often turned back by the threat of bandits, suspicion, and lack of supplies in the frigid conditions. Some were even killed when their mapping tools were discovered in the secret pockets on their robes and in their hollowed-out walking staffs. However, one man named Nain Singh would travel undetected for thousands of miles while simultaneously counting each pace of his journey to measure distances. He would even sneak into the city of Lhasa and sit across from the God King of Tibet in the palace of the Dalai Lama. His return lit a fire among Europeans to see for themselves the dazzling places that he described. But the Tibetans, finding out that their defenses had been breached, were more determined than ever to keep foreigners out. They began to torture and kill anyone who aided trespassers. The first European to attempt to enter Lhasa was a Russian colonel named Nikolai Preovalsky. His first journey to Tibet ended in disaster. Colonel Nikolai had intended to enter Tibet from the northwest, as it was less guarded by Tibetans, but he was resisted from the outset. In the beginning of the voyage, the colonel and his Mongol caravan were charged by roaming Chinese cavalry. Already having to stand the test of battle, they fought onward but lost many crucial supplies in the attack. Several weeks later, starving and without food for the cruel winter, Colonel Nikolai was forced to withdraw. Determined not to be defeated by bandits again, the Russian colonel re-entered Tibet 6 years later, but this time with an armed bodyguard of Cossack gunmen who were renowned for their skills with a rifle. This formidable party was not afraid to enter Lhasa by force if need be, and soon word reached the Tibet government in Lhasa that Russian military personnel were advancing toward the capital. Immediately 3,000 warrior monks were sent to deter him, and the villagers were threatened with death if they sold any food or provisions to the Russians. Just 150 miles from Lhasa, Colonel Nikolai's dreams were dashed, and he was ordered to return by the way he came under threat of overwhelming force. Where the Russians failed, the British planned to succeed. They entered the race to Lhasa in 1886 when the British government dispatched Coleman Macaulay on a mission to Tibet. Many experts and scientists were sent with 300 armed guards to accompany the expedition, but upon hearing of such a force, the Tibetans rushed an army to the border. At this, the British panicked and called off the mission. 2 years later, the Tibetan army along the border would fight a bloody battle with the British, and the severed relations would complicate all efforts to breach the mystical city. The first attempt of the British had failed even to cross into the Forbidden Land, and had only succeeded in making the matter much more complicated. Meanwhile, William Rockhill was the first American to try and gain access to the Forbidden City. He planned to do so by means of stealth and set about learning the Tibetan language for 4 years in preparation. In 1888, Rockhill left from China in an attempt to enter Tibet from the northeast. He had hoped in those sparsely populated regions to avoid bandits and suspicion from other caravans. Dressed in a Chinese costume, he traveled along the Silk Road for 1,000 miles before reaching the borderlands between China and Tibet. His Chinese servant and cart mule were his only companions on that long journey. They slept every night in ancient Chinese inns along the road in miserable conditions. Upon reaching the last town before Tibet, Rockhill encountered his first obstacles in suspicion from the local authorities. He had determined to go on alone after being asked by 3 policemen to report to the local governor immediately for questioning. Frightened by this request, Rockhill assumed a new disguise and, setting out alone, he reached a large monastery inside the Tibetan border after a few days. His failure to secure a guide for the final trek towards Lhasa became concerning, and his delays only increased the risk of his disguise being compromised. The money he had brought with him was almost gone, and the Tibetans were on high alert for intruders of any kind. Rockhill's money finally ran out at the monastery about 400 miles from Lhasa, and he was forced to return to China, having failed to lay eyes on the holy city. A minister hoped to succeed where the previous explorers had failed. Reverend Henry Lancel was a British clergyman who dreamed of establishing a relationship between the Church of England and the Dalai Lama. He proposed that a letter of friendship be written to the God King of Tibet from the Archbishop of Canterbury, and that he would personally deliver it to his palace in Lhasa. This news was received with enthusiasm, and the letter was written and signed by the Archbishop. In 1888, Reverend Henry arrived on the Indian side of the Himalayas in British-controlled Ladakh. At once, he began his search for a guide to take him through the Himalayas, but could not find anyone willing to risk the extreme punishment if they were discovered. He left Ladakh and looked for another guide in the Nepalese city of Kathmandu, the town of Kalimpong, and Peking, China, but failed to find help from anyone. Finally, the British ambassador in Peking, China, convinced him that the political situation was too volatile for him to receive any permission to visit the interior, and Reverend Henry began the long voyage back to England. His failure was received with hesitancy, and only after lingering in Asia for months did he finally accept his defeat. The French were the next to send hopeful gate crashers to the roof of the world. Gabriel Bonvalot, a famed Asiatic explorer, together with Prince Henry of Orleans and Father Dedekind, a Belgian, settled on entering Tibet from the extreme northern wilderness in 1889. Upon setting out, mountain sickness began to decimate their caravan men. Cruel blizzards, sub-zero temperatures, and limited visibility from the snow caused death and destruction to the journey, but still they persisted. They finally crossed into Tibet and decided to take the pilgrim's route toward Lhasa. Bonvalot had, in his fear, kept his dream of reaching Lhasa a secret even from his fellow Europeans until this moment. Upon hearing the true intentions of their expedition, they were all full of excitement and continued without alerting any Tibetans of their presence. The first Tibetan caravans they encountered were friendly, but gradually suspicion mounted as they got nearer to Lhasa. The resistance made them desperate, and they rushed their camp to Tengri Nor, a sacred lake not far from Lhasa. It was here that on marching further, they were met by a multitude of armed guards and officials from Lhasa who intercepted the strange caravan after suspecting the true motive. It was not long before the Frenchmen confessed to the officials, and in their weariness, it was agreed that to send the French back the way they came would mean certain death. They were thus allowed to exit in the Far East with an escort of fresh supplies. Only 95 miles from Lhasa, The French journey ended in failure, though closer than any previous attempt to this point. Still, the mysteries of Lhasa were hidden from the outside world. European imagination ran wild with ideas of what may be happening in Tibet, and curiosity motivated future attempts to continue. In 1889, a British captain named Hamilton Bower was on an expedition to Central Asia to avenge the death of a young Scottish explorer who had been killed by a giant Afghan years before. Bower, in his search for this man, had uncovered a manuscript from a mud temple which told of a lost Buddhist civilization underneath the Chinese deserts of Central Asia. The captain had eventually tracked and killed the Afghan in Samarkand, in modern Uzbekistan, but he sent back the manuscript to the British offices in India. Europe was enchanted by the tales from this expedition, and the race for lost Silk Road treasures and civilizations grew more intense. Prompted by this new enthusiasm, Bower was sent out again into Central Asia under the guise of another killing errand with Captain G.W. Thorold. Their real task was to explore and uncover the mystery of Tibet by sneaking in. This mission was so secret that it was hidden from all but the top authorities in the British government, and no one knew any of their errand at the time. The two captains crossed into Tibet from the west on July 3, 1891, with a guide, a cook, a physician, and 6 caravan men. 400 miles of rain exposure, sickness, and snow passed on those barren lands before they encountered any other human beings. At the first sign of herdsmen, the captains donned the disguises of Muslim traders, which fooled one caravan and won them supplies as a result. Yet these Tibetans were not to be deceived forever. The curious path they had taken from the west brought skepticism, and caravans began to shadow them as they approached Lhasa. At one point, they were deliberately set on the wrong trail by suspicious traders and met more and more doubt as they went. They were not far from the same lake of Tengri Nor that the French had reached just 18 months before, but the pressure was on to reach Lhasa before being discovered. One day, their camp was approached by a senior official with his retinue who had seen enough to know that this caravan was up to something. They questioned Bower to the point that he had no choice but to confess his identity as an Englishman. After a month of negotiations, it was decided that they could be allowed to continue east, and thus complete the first crossing of Tibet from west to east by any European. Their appeals to travel through Lhasa were emphatically denied. The captains had learned much about Tibet's geography through this expedition, but once again Lhasa survived a march against its formidable defenses. Until this point, the merciful attitude of the Tibetans when dealing with intruders had become known among those few who had survived to tell the tale. However, this precedent was shattered when Jules Dutreuil-Drouin attempted to enter Lhasa in 1893. Determined to win the race for France, Jules and his companion, explorer Fernand Gérard, first entered Central Asia with a caravan of 13 men and turned their sights south toward Lhasa. The dreadful crossing of mountains and wilderness from the north took 4 months and cost the lives of nearly half of their 61 pack animals. Just 6 days' march from Lhasa, they were halted by Tibetans who, upon seeing their approach, denied them entry to the city. Half-starved and in terrible health, Dutreuil-Drouin was furious at this rejection. For 50 days, a stalemate ensued as he attempted to negotiate a visit to Lhasa in order to resupply before leaving. They were only given the option to exit eastward. After weeks of a frustrating journey out of Tibet, the Frenchmen became very ill and forced their caravan into an unwelcoming village for the night. They were refused food and lodging, and the rainy night made Doreen's developing bronchitis much worse. To further frustrate the Europeans, 2 of their remaining horses were stolen during the storm. The following morning, in retaliation, Dutreuil-Drouin ordered his men to seize 2 village horses. The Tibetans, having been provoked by the cultural miscues and disrespect on the part of treacherous, were ready to retaliate. When the French caravan set out, they were ambushed by the villagers. Treacherous was shot in the stomach, and Fernand Gérard was overtaken and beaten nearly to death. The Tibetans dumped Fernand outside their village, where he made his way to a smaller village and received care and shelter. There, another survivor of the attack met him and revealed the final fate of Treacherous. He had been bound hand and foot and thrown into the nearby icy river. He was last seen desperately trying to keep himself afloat. His mission to Tibet cost him his life. The story of Treacherous struck fear into the hearts of subsequent explorers, deterring many from attempting to follow in his footsteps. Yet for others, the desire to see the sacred city only deepened. One such man was Henry Savage Landor. His account of his voyage into Tibet, if assumed to be true, is one of the most astonishing tales of any explorer who ever made such an attempt. In 1897, already a famed explorer and author, Savage Landor crossed into Tibet with 30 men in the hopes of being the first European to reach Lhasa. Within 5 days, all but 9 companions deserted him. The remaining men still feared the punishment for smuggling an Englishman into Tibet, and 5 more deserted shortly afterward. Finally, 2 more men stole away in the night with valuable supplies and began to alert locals that an Englishman was in their country. The 2 who remained with Savage Landor were to pay dearly for their loyalty. Tibetans from the area began to search the countryside for the roaming Englishman as the 3 companions made a desperate bid to reach Lhasa. In a river crossing, their haste proved disastrous when the yaks carrying food and ammunition drowned. Now, stranded without food or supplies, they took their last resort and entered a village to avoid starvation. At first, the villagers treated them well, but once their guard was down, the 3 men were seized and beaten by 30 Tibetans. They were then brought before a Grand Lama who served as the judge of the area. In his book, In the Forbidden Land, Savage Landor recounts lying on the ground in chains in a tent where he could hear the first of his 2 servants being brought before the official. He first heard shouting, followed by silence. Then, as if from a nightmare, came the sound of a crude whip. The lashes fell on his suffering servant dozens of times before he lost count. Next, Savage Landor was brought before the official, and in his elementary Tibetan, he disguised his fears as indifference to the best of his ability. He hoped his fearless response would provoke his captors to believe he had great powers and thus release him. Instead, it infuriated the judge, who commanded the already bloodied servant to be beaten again. Over the next few days, Savage Landor and his servants were made to ride on spiked saddles that pierced their bodies as they were taken to a hilltop monastery. There, they were tied to logs, burned, and threatened with beheading. The killing sword stopped only inches from Savage Landor's neck in an attempt to intimidate him, but he remained steadfast, refusing to show fear. The charade of courage began to take effect as the lamas eventually became convinced that Savage Landor possessed extreme occult powers. His Western utensils and equipment were totally unfamiliar and caused great anxiety among the Tibetans. They speculated their purpose was to assist Savage Landor in sorcery. This fear was confirmed when one Tibetan Lama misfired Savage Landor's gun, losing an ear and his arm in the explosion. However, the final sign of Savage Landor's supposed powers came when the oracles were consulted about what to do with the men. Upon observing Savage Landor's webbed hands, the oracles declared that he matched the description of a mythical being who could never be harmed, no matter how hard they were struck. At that moment, the fate of Savage Landor and his companions was decided in their favor. They were released somewhat graciously and led south to India, where British doctors saved their lives and confirmed the injuries they had sustained. Bizarre wounds from the saddle spikes, a burned eye, and the marks of tight bonds and lashes covered each companion. Savage Landor's 2-volume account made a name for him, and while some skeptics scorned his sensational journey, he received a hero's welcome from most. Thus, the Tibetans prevailed against the explorers of the 19th century, and Lhasa remained unseen by European eyes during those years. The allure of Lhasa and the mysteries of Tibet captivated the imaginations of explorers from across Europe, leading them to undertake perilous journeys that often ended in failure, loss, or death. Despite their determination, Tibet's physical and cultural defenses remained impenetrable for most. The rich secrets of Lhasa remained hidden, fueling even more fantastic tales of the forbidden city and its sacred treasures. Yet the few who reached the edge of Lhasa or survived the harsh journey left behind stories that still captivate us today. Their tales serve as a reminder of the unyielding power of curiosity, the dangers of obsession, and the enduring mystery of Lhasa.